Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Race, Wealth, and Health. So excited to have Dr. Michael Thomas joining me this week to talk about Black financial culture. We will discuss everything you want to know about the journey towards financial wellness. And so thank you, Dr. Thomas, for joining us.
Yeah, I appreciate you. To be just fairly transparent here, I've done a number of podcasts, and I particularly enjoy doing a prep session where the host is actually inquisitive and engaging in the process and asking thoughtful questions and actually engaging in the world of the person who's coming on. It's incredibly refreshing, and I appreciate it. So thank you.
Awesome. I'm really excited to get in this conversation. By brief way of introduction, Dr. Michael Thomas is a lecturer at the University of Georgia and the author of a really amazing book called Black Financial Culture. I think you can see it in the video here.
Yeah.
So speaking of the prep call that we had, Dr. Thomas told me about the book and I actually got a chance to read it. So I do want to let my listeners know it is a very, very easy read. When he told me it was like 100 pages, I said, okay, maybe I can. I might be able to handle that. And I did. I read it, I think, on the flight.
Yeah, that was intentional. In this particular book, it easily could have been 250, 300 pages going into very deeply a lot of these ideas. But the issue is, and what we know about teaching in general, is that people, even when they sit in the class, only remember 20% maybe of what they've learned. So by the time you move from one topic to the next, there's this regression that's happening all along. So you actually lose stuff along the way, and then you move on to something else. So the idea here was to create something that my mom would read. And when reading it, it felt like, man, this feels easier than maybe how I'm perceiving it, right? To get folks to start to wrestle a little bit with their own paradigms around what's feasible, what's possible, even in their own lives. And I just wanted to focus on what could be done as opposed to the mountain of things that we always talk about that creates anxiety and overwhelm, analysis of paralysis, and people ultimately do nothing at all. So the goal there was, I think I can do this, right? And then for them to express their agency in a way that they choose, which I think is the beautiful element of it as well. But I'm pretty sure we'll get to that at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah. Before we get too deep in the book, I just wanted to, that was my little plug and shout out, but I do want to start by you giving a much better introduction to yourself and how you got into this work, into higher ed, how you got into the work of being concerned about financial wellness.
Absolutely. Well, I would say naturally, I'm an empath. It has its pros and it has its cons. And as I think about my earliest memories as a child, I would feel very deeply for the plight of others. I remember when I was younger, the first fight I got into at school, I was fighting for someone else because there was another kid that did something to another kid, and I just felt like it was wrong. And I stepped up to the other kid and we just started going at it. And that's just kind of always been my personality. I feel very deeply. I pick up on energy. I'm always mindful of other people's space, even if it's an inconvenience to me. So the whole wellness and health and caring is probably more or less something that I was born with. I think that that's a part of my natural genetic design. I love math because it is very objective. And in a world that can be very subjective, full of nuance. So what it does is it helps take away or diminish uncertainty so that I can actually see my way through something, right? And having grown up in Gary, Indiana, especially during the 90s. It was really big gang culture. Where I'm from, more specifically, you were either Latin kings, vice lords, gangster disciples, so on and so forth. And Gary was the murder capital of the United States for a few years, top three. And it was a time where you could literally be sitting in a car and somebody drive up beside you and you catch bullets. I mean, that was the reality of what we experienced. My mom would always tell me growing up, bullets don't have eyes. Like every time I left the house, be mindful of where you are. Always be mindful of your surroundings. So math allowed for me the opportunity and space to find some certainty, oftentimes in uncertain spaces. And to know that mathematically, you could do things in such a way to where as long as you could see it, right? If I could say with a budget that I know with the resources that I have and being very honest and vulnerable, that all that I really have to give is $10. I know that I can do this sustainably. Then if I create a spending plan, I know that as long as I do what I set up to do, I'm going to achieve the goal because the goal is already laid out on paper. I've considered my circumstances. I've considered my financial capacity. As long as I can stick to the plan without any major disruptions that would take me away from that, in which roughly 60% to 65% of households experience a financial shock. And that's something that we don't talk about when it comes to wealth creation or even just financial stability. But as long as we can get it on paper and we're in a season where we have stability and we can consistently work to those goals, there's really no reason why we can't achieve it. And so that's the beauty of now connecting math to health and caring and all these different things, and more specifically financial wellness, is that when I step in, I clearly understand based on a client's disposition, based on the reality of their circumstances, they may not have the emotional, cognitive, and physical capacity to see beyond what they're going through. So my work allows for me actually to be that intermediary, to see the thing that they can't see because they're still wrestling with some other things. And I can help that person stay on track and be working towards the goal while they're working around themselves. And there's no reason why you can't do both. Where we oftentimes find an issue is that we give basically canned recommendations, but we don't give people the space to work around their circumstances and their situation. And because we give the canned recommendations as if this is the only way that you can do it, if they struggle, if they miss the mark, especially if they're experiencing something tragic or significant, it then reinforces the negative emotions and angst and why am I doing this anyway? So the beauty of this is that we can take the math that based on the appropriate assumptions, create a strategic plan that is rooted in realistic goals that are tethered to a sense of purpose that's unique to the individual that you're serving. Not what I enjoy, not what I think your goal should be, but what is meaningful for you. And it's okay to try a variety of things to figure out where joy comes from because it's a process. And then to have somebody every step of the way to say, you know, you did that. That's amazing, right? You've gotten this far. Do you not realize that most people don't have $500 or $1,000 saved for an emergency? You have $2,000 saved. And so what happens is that when you work with people, you start to help them create a different narrative internally with their internal self-talk that then exists beyond the space of your sessions. And that's the beauty of what I get to do. So I get to take my math, I get to lean into the empathic side that I have, which is a real care for the individuals that I get an opportunity to serve. And I say this all the time, money is not the main thing, you are. That's a line that I put in a book. I believe that was in the first chapter, because I think that oftentimes we make money the main thing. But when you serve, it's important because it's a part of the system that we navigate. However, when you work with people who have millions of dollars and they are unhappy, they actually will tell you that they felt happier when they had less. And
Yeah.
you see this over and over again. At a certain point, we have to wake up and say, maybe this aim that's associated with capitalism and a marketing that revolves around
Mhm.
it to drive GDP and our ecosystem, the system, doesn't necessarily lead to the end that many of us hope for. And what
Right.
happens is that you sit in these conversations and people say, I didn't spend enough time with my kids.
Yeah.
Now that they're older, they don't want to come home. They don't want to talk. They don't want to X, Y, and
Mhm.
Z.
I was gonna say, as you were saying that, the first thing that comes to mind is Notorious B.I.G. More money, more problems, right?
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
always an assumption that
Absolutely.
money is going to equate to happiness or what someone would identify as personal success. But I did have one quick question. I know you mentioned working with your clients. So to clarify, do you do financial planning with your clients, or how would you describe
Question.
what your work
Very
is
good
specifically
question.
with clients?
I don't do financial planning. What I do is more of the financial coaching. It's a mix between financial coaching and financial therapy. I'm an accredited financial counselor. I have been
Mhm.
so since 2015. And I've also been a member and very instrumental with the Financial Therapy Association since
Ooh.
2015 as well. And so those leanings actually have a significant impact in the way that I work with clients. As it relates to investing, what I can do is investment education. When I say investment education, what I mean is when we talk about diversification, what are we really talking about? Because
Mhm.
there's a lot of statistics that are at play when we understand diversification and what it really means. When we talk about the markets, what are we really talking about? We're talking about the S&P 500. But what does that mean? How is it constructed? Is there a board or a committee that oversees it? What are the
Right.
criteria to be even listed, right? So what I do goes beyond just the rote conversations around just diversify. I say then, all right, let's understand the language of this ecosystem. What does this mean? What does small cap, large cap, medium cap mean? What are the different sectors within investing? And what does this mean as it relates to risk of these investments? And then how do
Mhm.
we diversify across risk levels to optimize our returns? So what happens is that people start to wake up and say, oh, there's a lot more to this than I thought that
Ah,
there was, which is
mhm.
incredibly important because if you don't understand the risk that you're taking, oftentimes what happens is that you engage with it as if there's no risk at all.
Right. Yeah.
which
Yeah.
which
Absolutely.
is right, which is the struggle because if we're on Instagram, if we're on YouTube, if we're on
Yeah.
TikTok, whatever it may be, what people need to understand is we navigate a system where everybody is trying to sell you something with limited information and limited viability of return, right?
Absolutely.
But because of someone's circumstances, especially if they're feeling down and out, they want to believe that this is true. It's not because they're not savvy, they're not smart. It's just that when stress compounds,
Mhm.
when we're anxious, we're overwhelmed, we don't have the capacity to really think thoughtfully about it. For anybody who's listening to this right now, whenever
Mhm.
you hear any of these things, the first thing that they try to do is to invoke some sense of fear. And then that just kind of leads to the autonomic nervous system where we're going to engage in flight or fight. And so they create this gap and then they create a narrative to say that I'm going to fill this gap. And then they set you up for this notion of we're going to do it in a way quicker than any other platform can do it because we know you're tired of trying all these things that don't work. And then on the end of it, they say, well, you only have 3 days to register for this
Of
$2,500
course.
class.
Yeah. Yeah.
May have a little bit of substance, but the issue is that we're mixing lies with substance. So we
Right.
don't necessarily understand where truth and fiction are intertwined within these narratives. So a lot of what I
Mhm.
do in that regard is help people to understand first, where are you? Where is it that you're trying to go? Understand something about risk profile, risk capacity, and then objective risk. And what I mean by that is that when I talk about risk, I just don't talk about it in terms of volatility in a certain way. I look at it pure dollars. So what I'm going to show a client is say, hey, based on the investments that you're making, let's just say you had $100,000 invested. The risk profile of this investment, if it goes to the downside relative to the market, could be a 20% or 30% drop. On a $100,000 portfolio, that's $20,000 loss or $30,000 loss. How does that actually make you feel?
Right.
Right? Actually seeing that in real life and saying, oh, I don't know if I would feel comfortable with
Right.
riding out that type of loss temporarily,
Yeah.
right? Because that's very different than saying that something has a beta of 2 or 3. When we
What's a
start talking
beta?
about, so beta coefficient basically is when you are looking at the S&P 500 and you're investing in something and comparing it to the market, what it's going to tell you is how does it move as the market moves? So if it moves with the S&P 500, it has a beta coefficient of 1, right? If it has more volatility than the S&P 500, that means that if the S&P 500 goes up 100% and in an investment has a beta of 2 or 200 times, then that means that we can see maybe 200% returns on a 100% move with the S&P 500. The issue, though, is that that's usually where the conversation stops. What we don't talk about is that if the S&P 500 goes down,
Yes.
you're
Mm-hmm.
looking at potentially 2 times the loss. And even in the back of my mind, that triggered me differently in just saying that,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So
And then,
understanding how information is being framed to you to
mm-hmm.
trigger you to take on something, generally speaking, where somebody's going to receive a fee or commission without actually understanding your unique situation means that now, because I don't understand really anything that I'm doing, somebody's just telling to just trust me. I have social proof, meaning that they bring some people in and say that we've made $1 million and that spotlight effect, because we're only going to highlight the winners, but not the thousands of people who didn't win.
Right.
And it creates a system of feel good hopium, as we would call it in the crypto space, where people are wanting something to believe in. And what happens, unfortunately, is that they don't develop the appropriate habits for investing, the understanding for investing, and they engage with it in a way where they're buying when prices are up and they're selling when prices are low. And so if somebody tells me that, oh, yeah, I invest, I want to know how. What
Mm-hmm.
are your habits? Just telling me you invest is not telling me anything at all. You can
Mm-hmm.
invest for 10 years and not earn any money because of your habits. And you're not understanding that you also need to regulate your emotions with investing.
Right.
Because if you're on Yahoo Finance, if you're on places like Robinhood, one of Robinhood's leading taglines has been around this notion of access. My
Mm-hmm.
stance has always been that access does not necessarily equal success. Just because I have
That's true.
access to something doesn't mean that I have the capacity to use it effectively to
Mm-hmm.
see the returns or to take on the necessary level of risk that I need to achieve the goal that I want to. And then understanding risk and volatility relative to time horizon and how things generally smooth out over time and why that happens. And if the market goes down, they're unbothered because they actually understand what's happening. So what we do is we kind of usher people into, oh, you need to invest, you need to get real estate, you need to get, but nobody shares any of the back end. I've
Right.
had real estate, I've invested. Nobody shares when your tenant randomly moves out in the middle of the night and you don't know that they're not there, or they can't pay, or something gets broken and it needs to be fixed and it constantly
Right.
feels like it's this revolving. You're like, I don't want to own you.
Revolving
I know
door.
more
Yeah.
people who have gone into real estate and were so happy that they sold that home that they initially got than those who go in and stick with it for the long haul. It's not for everyone. But we have to assess ourselves and understand our capacity to actually engage in this by fully understanding not just how I get up the mountain, but how do I get off? And that's where a lot of people struggle because nobody preps you for the totality of this. And this would be the last thing that I say. For instance, there are a lot of conversations around wealth creation. completely get it. But if I am setting money aside in a custodial account, meaning that I have temporary ownership of it until my child turns a certain age, then they have those resources. And it is my hope that they don't go into those funds, liquidate them, and just frivolously spend in their 20s. And we all know that's more than likely possibly the case in many instances. The better thing, though, is what is the family culture around money? Not just the money piece, because money comes and goes. If we look at any of the literature on wealth and intergenerational wealth creation, generally after 3 generations, the money's all gone. But we never talk about that piece of it. So right now, for a lot of Black households, the conversation is around wealth, but it's more than just wealth. It's about conversations around money, having the appropriate mindset, self-regulation around money, having a longer vision and picture about the resources and how, yes, there's portion of it that we use for our own personal good and satisfaction, but there's also a piece and portion that we want to pay forward. We don't have those type of conversations. We think that, oh, the insurance policy is about to hit. Family gets $100,000 to $250,000. But you know what, Joycelyn? In many instances where I work, that money is gone within a year.
Right, of course. Yeah.
Right? So we don't have complete conversations. A lot of what I do is I need you to understand the entire arc of this journey. And we need to have a plan for every piece of this, because there's going to be a barrier, there's going to be an obstacle, ultimately in a way that I frame it, to ensure that the things that we know that typically happen, if we just give someone money or someone has a windfall, it's gone because they didn't develop the capacity to either one, generate that money on their own, and then 2, the capacity to be able to sustain it. And especially if that money goes to people who've never had money, it seems like a lot, but it goes really quickly. So when I say holistic, that's what I mean in terms of systems, internally and externally, holistic in terms of what this process actually looks like. You're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes as we're working on a budget or a spending plan, as we're investing, we buy too soon or sell too late or whatever it may be. But there needs to be grace. There needs to be empathy for self and others in navigating it, so we can actually learn from our mistakes instead of doubling down. Because what I found is that when something doesn't work, people do more of the wrong thing, right? Because there's no vulnerability there, and there's no space for new information to come in, because we won't watch our own game tape.
I had a quick question. I wanted to click on something that you mentioned in terms of the vulnerability there. What I got from what you say you do is around the idea of a mix between financial education and financial therapy, as you mentioned. You said one of the first things that you do is you meet with the client and understand where they are.
Yes.
Being someone who's worked with entrepreneurs as well, specifically entrepreneurs of colors, often immigrant families, that is sometimes one of the hardest parts and hurdles to get over, because as you mentioned, and what came up for me was the vulnerability piece of it. And to be completely honest about what their financial situation is. And when we spoke with Dr. Watkins earlier, one of the things she talked about was when you're having those types of conversations with people, people are almost financially naked with you, if you will, right? That they are bearing their all. And so how do you work through that? One, how do you work with your clients to get them to feel comfortable enough to open up and be fully transparent about what their financial situation is? And then what would you say to someone who's thinking about wanting to work with someone, whether it's you or any other professional? Like, what are the things that they should be thinking about when it comes to working with someone in this space?
Absolutely. I would say that one of the first things that I do when working with clients is that I share with them what my process looks like. So you have the choice to opt in or opt out of it. There is no surprise here, especially when working with men more specifically. Because honestly, even though I've tried to gear a lot of my services towards men and tried to have those conversations there for very personal reasons, honestly, that's been a very difficult task. So the bulk of my clients have been women.
Mhm.
So when I engage in these conversations, I let them know that this is my process. It's called PPP, not Paycheck Protection Program.
Not the PPP loans that
I
folks
hope, I hope y'all
are,
are all right in these streets
not
with
the
these
PPP loans that
PPP
are
loans.
catching up
They
to
might
some
be
people
coming
right
back.
now.
They might be coming back to bite some folks.
It is.
So PPP means to process, and then process. So the first thing that we do is that we just kind of process where we are, where we've been, where we may want to go. Because what that does is that it helps me understand landmines when navigating with a client. If I understand that something's very sensitive, um, I'm going to speak to that. I'm going to say, based on something that you said, there could be an opportunity to explore this further. But I'm not going to go there if you were not ready to go there. And I give them the space to be able to say, yes, I'm ready, or no, I'm not ready. So there's a lot of boundaries that I uncover that are not always explicitly stated because a client may
Mhm.
not have the language to express their boundaries. It's my responsibility as a professional. That's one of the things that I go and I try to discover. It's like, where are their boundaries? Where are sticky points for them? Where are they highly emotional? Where are they less emotional? Because the idea is to build momentum within the sessions. And if we start with some things that are less emotionally triggering, moderately emotionally triggering, I can balance those conversations out where I know going into the session, if we need to have a heavier conversation, I can do a lot of light things that then create the space for us to engage in something heavy. So we start with
Mhm.
heavy and we end with light. It's no different than when you're working out. What's your capacity to lift a certain weight? You don't go in and say, I'm going to just go in and bench 225 tomorrow because I'm just going to do it. No,
Right.
you're going to find out where your baseline is, and we're going to gradually progress from baseline. So that's what I do. I assess baseline of clients emotionally, cognitively, in terms of their strengths, understanding where their weaknesses are as well.
Mhm.
And then we're going to
Mhm.
focus on a strengths based approach. We're going to find
Right.
ways to mitigate the weaknesses so that they can still work around themselves while they're becoming the best version of themselves. And so that's a really big piece. We process, and usually that could take a month of processing. Then we
Mhm.
create a sustainable process. We think about our
Plan, essentially,
circumstances.
right?
Say what again?
It's essentially a plan, right? Like
Yeah,
you
we
create a.
it's a plan, and it's the client's plan
Mhm.
basically. Now I need for the client to be able to identify when they've been successful, why they've been successful, and I'm using the exploration of them to create an effective strategy that works for them. Because what happens is that if they already have proven success doing something a particular way, it creates narratives and internal self talk around success, where I've been successful, how I've been successful, right? So I'm speaking this out loud, but there's also something that's happening internally and psychologically and cognitively in a way that our brains light up, and dopamine that is necessary to working towards achieving a particular goal. If I feel and I've seen a certain level of success, it's easier to tap into trigger dopamine to actually work towards that. If
Right.
I don't have evidence of success, I don't get dopamine, I get cortisol. And
Mhm.
cortisol is a stress hormone. So what's happening now as I'm working towards a goal, I can have one person working with dopamine and another person working with cortisol, stress. Which one do you think is going to last long enough to achieve the goal? The
Right.
person you operating out of dopamine, because it
Mhm.
usually triggers sensations of feeling good and
Yeah.
elation. So I understand that sometimes the financially optimal strategy is literally a chemical in the brain that's being produced by an individual as they work towards a goal, completely biologically based. Am
Mhm.
I doing this based on stress? And there a certain level of stress is healthy. Or am I doing this with a sense of potential accomplishment and
Right.
achievement? And
Yeah.
we develop capacity for that, right? So
Yeah.
we do that. Then we create the process. We think about where the barriers are and where the opportunities within those barriers. If something comes up where it's kind of like, hey, if this barrier exists, I can't achieve the goal. So I have the goal, but I have to understand what are these things that are in the middle that may impede me from getting to that end. And then we create another strategy for those items or those areas. Do I automate it because I don't trust myself? Well, that's fine. You can, again, work around yourself while you're becoming the best version of yourself through automation. Is it that clutter or space? Right? Maybe it's I don't operate well because everything is chaotic around me. So one of the things that would be an actionable item that I'll have for a client is to actually, we're just going to take the week. We're going to do a little each day and create a space for you that creates peace, that creates calm, and creates an environment for you to be your best self and to be present. Right? So for a lot of clients, that's one of the things that I encourage them to do. We need to create the space first. And maybe sometimes the space is with me. And if that's the case, then what we'll do is we'll do a flipped session where I'll provide some educational materials, very short to the point. They'll review that information. I'll check in with them the day before, make sure that they have. And then when they come in, I'll help create the space for them so they can actually engage in the work. And then I can be there to help guide them through. Because I've been doing this for so long, and it always bothered me that we would do nothing if a client would leave in different spaces and not do anything. Well, then the question is, well, maybe we're not effectively assessing the needs of this client and how we can best serve them. So I'll do a flipped design of a session where we can use my space. I'll play some Sade in the background if they want Sade in the background. If they want some jazz, whatever it may be. If we want to do a wine tasting while we're working on it as well, you bring a bottle, I bring a bottle. Like, let's create the experience, because now this is about connection and engagement and feeling good around numbers that are working towards something. And so for me, this is a very human related process, because money is a conduit to a human need at the end of the day, or perceived human need. So if I can help create that space for someone who doesn't already have the space, then let's do it. So that's a big piece there. And then we process slowly, just like a procession and a graduation. You got the bagpipe playing, you got them coming out, whatever it may be. We're just going to move slowly and build momentum gradually, right? Because it's what we can sustainably do, not inconsistently do.
Right.
To achieve the goal. So we're finding baseline and working. So that's the process. And then I use something called NURSE: name, understand, respect, support, explore. That's an empathetic process of inquiry that invokes empathy and compassion, because there are 3 prongs of empathy: affective, cognitive, what I understand about you; affective, my ability to feel what you feel without being overwhelmed with the same emotions; and then compassionate empathy, which is how do I respond in such a way based on what I feel and what I know that's in the best interest of this individual. And sometimes that might be, compassion can be that I'm not the service provider for you. And I may need to find someone who is. That's a compassionate response. And so that's how I invoke empathy and compassion within sessions. And then we create a process, we create a mechanism for how we measure it, and we have some accountability. And we also build in mistakes. Mistakes are going to happen. And what we do is we celebrate our mistakes, because the idea that now I'm becoming aware of something that I've done without me imposing guilt and shame upon myself is considerable growth.
Absolutely.
And so there's that framing that happens. I'm touching this every element of the way, not just money, but emotionally, psychologically, developing systems. Because the idea is that at a certain point, I want you to say that I don't need you anymore.
Right.
I don't want you to be dependent upon me. Like if you're ready to launch. Then I know at a certain point, something else is going to come up, whether it's tax related, purchasing a home related, or whatever it may be, where you may want to have the confidence to reach out to me for, and I'll be there to serve you when that comes. But the idea isn't to create the situation where there's a power dynamic and you always feel as if you need me. This is about you being able to be independent and confident and vibrant and joyful with
Yeah.
where you were going. And that's the process.
That's amazing. So to round out the conversation around financial counseling and financial therapy, what would be maybe one or two tips for our listeners who are, say they're the listener who the idea of talking and thinking about their finances feels overwhelming and
Yeah.
elicits stress? I think you said more cortisol. What are one or two things that you would suggest to that individual who wants to get started along their financial journey?
Yeah,
One or
I
two
would
things.
say, again, there's no one right way for any and everybody. We're all very different. But one of the biggest things I would strongly encourage is to prioritize trying to get enough rest and sleep,
Mm.
because there's a whole line of research that talks about when we don't get enough sleep, we're groggy, we don't feel good. And it's so chronic sometimes we don't realize that it is because we're not sleeping well.
Mhm.
Sleep
Mhm.
apnea is a really big thing in a lot of communities. That's something that needs to be considered. And when we talk about sleep apnea, what we're talking about, there's not enough oxygen that's actually getting to our brains. But if your brain is not effectively being oxygenated as
Mhm.
you're navigating this process and you're not resting well, which this is a time where your body is healing itself, you're actually operating in a suboptimal level every day. So, what does that mean? You're more irritable, you
Mm.
have less impulse control, because irritability could actually be a stimulus for a maladaptive behavior for spending. So if I'm
What is a
already
maladaptive behavior, Dr.
very good
Let's break
question.
it
So maladaptive is, as we grow up, what happens is we experience things around money or around life in general. We create these adaptations to either self-soothe or to navigate circumstances rooted in trauma.
down. Mhm.
So when we say maladaptive, what we're saying is that you're no longer experiencing the same trauma. Your brain and body perceives it as trauma, and you're using a self-soothing mechanism or strategy that no longer fits this new space that you're in. This is why you can have incredibly successful people who won't spend any of their money. It's not because they're smart and savvy and all these other different things. Sometimes people's oversaving is a trauma response
Yeah,
because they're
absolutely.
riddled with anxiety. They're very fearful about something happening and they can't let go of this resource that they feel as if is going to provide them safety or control. Or you have somebody who wants to pursue being a CEO or an executive. Sometimes, believe it or not, y'all, sometimes that can be rooted in trauma. I can't trust people. So I want to be in a position where I don't have to trust. That's a
Yeah.
trauma response. And I always encourage people to be very mindful why you pursue certain things, because it can be rooted in an adaptive response. And it becomes maladaptive when we're no longer experiencing the same trauma, same circumstances, same lack, right? But yet we're navigating as if we are,
Right.
and our systems are operating with high levels of stress and cortisol, which then ultimately that can affect diabetes and all these other different things. Like there's so much
Mhm.
connected to this
Yes. Yes.
systems that's incredibly important to kind of consider and understand as it relates to navigating this stuff. So that's what we're getting at when we talk about a maladaptive response.
Yeah.
We're literally trying to protect ourselves, which is why I can
Mhm.
see grace and compassion even in these spaces, because I understand at that type of level. So understanding maladaptive and being able to just be aware of it, to be able to self-regulate, whether it's deep breathing exercises or it's saying, hey, let me go for a walk, which has actually been proven to lower stress levels and
Mhm.
to promote serotonin levels, which again are feelings of joy and mood and calm, that allows for us to again create a space to unpack something that we need to unpack with compassion, self-compassion, and care of self. And it
Yeah.
also expands the way that we see the world. So what happens is that when we're focused on a problem, we become very tunnel visioned around the problem. So much
Yeah.
so that that problem then becomes bigger and it starts to overwhelm our senses. When we actually go outside and step away from it, we actually start walking. And what does that make us do? It causes us to breathe
Yeah.
systems that can actually get us to mitigate our autonomic nervous response, We're no longer leaning into fight or flight. We're getting ourselves back to neutral. Another thing that I do with clients is that oftentimes if we schedule a session, what we're going to do is we're going to do a Zoom walk and talk. Especially if I know if they're high anxiety, high stress, we're going to go outside. We're going to walk together. We're going to talk together. We're going to breathe together. So those are some things that can actually help the process. So at the end of the day, for me, this is what's actually going to help you.
Absolutely.
Right? Like that's why we do this. And Joycelyn, I'm not motivated by money.
And that's the goal, right? The goal is working with individuals, helping them to find joy in their financial situation, helping them to find financial wellness, which is really just being at peace, being in a good space with where they are in their finances.
Success.
Absolutely.
To me, that's success.
Absolutely. But success, recognizing that success will look different for each individual. And
absolutely. So really, because your peace and where you find it and your joy where you find it is very unique to the individual.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you for that. Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. I'm going to switch gears, which will probably be the second part of our combo, and talk a little bit about this book. Well, that's all for today, folks. Don't forget to join us next week as Dr. Michael Thomas continues the conversation and talks about his book, Black Financial Culture. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.